There's a kind of societal dissonance that I've started to notice more and more over the last few months. So on paper, things are supposed to be stabilizing. Inflation is down. The crisis phase is kind of meant to be over. And yet daily life still feels tighter than it did a few years ago. And this is the part that's really quite hard to articulate without sounding hysterical or ungrateful. But the reality is that working hard and earning an honest wage, it just doesn't get you as far as it used to. And when people try to name this, they're often shut down with a technical correction like inflation has slowed down and it all depends on the country you're talking about. All of these points can be true, and yet they still miss the point. So yes, inflation may have slowed, but prices didn't reset. And when wages lag the cumulative rise in essentials, people just feel poorer even when the economy is technically stable. So the things you cannot opt out of, like housing, energy, and food, they now absorb a larger share of income than they used to. So even where headline inflation has cooled, these costs have settled at a higher baseline. Rents didn't fall back, they continue to climb, and food prices stabilized after jumping, they didn't decrease. Meanwhile, wages adjust very slowly and unevenly, sometimes not at all, unless you work in tech or finance, so people experience a specific kind of squeeze. This is why professionals who are doing fine, they still feel unsettled. The issue isn't extravagance or poor budgeting, it's really that the floor of normal life has risen faster than the mechanisms meant to support it. And that's only the first layer. There are another 4 points which I want to get into right now. So the second point is that asset inflation has outpaced work. So at the same time that the floor of everyday life has risen, something else has been happening in the background, and this is where the real divergence begins, because assets have been inflating much faster than wages. So it doesn't really matter what you talk about, if you talk about property or equities or gold or crypto or some kind of financial instrument, they have appreciated at a pace that wages just cannot really match. So maybe, of course, it's not everywhere, but consistently enough to reshape how security is actually produced. So this creates a quiet split inside the same economy. If your income comes primarily from wages, life just feels tighter and more conditional and more exposed. You are constantly managing cash flow against rising fixed costs, and progress just feels really fragile. If you own appreciating assets, the experience is very different. Things feel kind of effortless, like even during periods officially described as a crisis, your balance sheet moves in the right direction. You feel insulated and your options expand rather than contract. It's the same society, the same time period, but radically different realities. And this is where the sense that something isn't adding up really comes from. It's not that people suddenly expect luxury, it's that effort no longer converts cleanly into security. Assets compound, labor treads water, and that single divergence explains a great deal of the low-level frustration people struggle to name. You can be doing very well by every conventional metric and still feel oddly behind because the rules of the game quietly changed and most people were not told about it. The third point is that the comparison trap has gone global. So what turns this structural shift into a constant emotional pressure is comparison, social comparison. So for most of history, comparison was local and bounded. You measured yourself against your colleagues and your neighbors, so people who were roughly in the same economic environment as you. That constraint no longer exists. Today you are constantly exposed to lifestyles, assets, and trajectories of people far outside your reference group, like across cities, countries, income brackets, and asset classes. Some genuinely are doing far better, but some are just exaggerating their reality, and some benefited from timing rather than effort. But the problem is that your nervous system doesn't distinguish between those categories. It just simply registers your relative position. So this is why the feeling of being left behind has intensified even among people whose absolute living standards have not collapsed. You are no longer comparing yourself to the past. You are comparing yourself to the visible winners of a highly financialized system. And crucially, those winners are not necessarily working harder. Very often they just bought earlier and they were positioned very differently when certain assets started to take off and accelerate. So the difference is temporal. It's not moral, but it often does feel personal. Social media doesn't create this gap, but it removes the psychological insulation that once softened it. So this is why people feel poorer, even when their lives are actually objectively fully functional and they are improving. They are experiencing some kind of upward trajectory. It just doesn't feel like that. The fourth point is a very important one, and it is that risk has been shifted from systems onto individuals. So laid on top of the previous points about assets and wages, there is this second shift, which is that more risk has been pushed downward and away from institutions and onto individuals. So what I mean by this is that things that were once buffered collectively are now managed privately. Job security is much less common than it used to be, and you have to deal with that uncertainty yourself. You have to find a new job, constantly keep updating your CV, keep upskilling, making sure that you are employable. That was not the case just 20, 30 years ago. Housing volatility has increased, meaning you need more money set aside for rent increases and the possibility that you are going to have to move. Because of how people now live, they have to pay for childcare instead of using the family network, and even geographic mobility adds to the cost and uncertainty because people often have to move around now because they are competing globally, not locally. So none of these things feel catastrophic on their own, but together they change the texture of everyday life. You are expected to self-insure against a wider range of outcomes, to anticipate shocks, to absorb delays, and to plan for contingencies that used to be softened by stable systems. This is why life feels more expensive even when consumption hasn't exploded. You're not necessarily buying more things, you're just carrying more risk and responsibility. There's more uncertainty and more downstream consequences for decisions that used to be more spread out, socialized. So that constant low-grade vigilance has a cost. It makes people much more cautious, less generous with risk, and more defensive in their planning, meaning that they will never enter into assets, which is really kind of the one thing that could make a difference. So again, this isn't a failure of mindset or resilience. It's just a rational response to an uncertain environment where the margin for error has narrowed. So when assets rise faster than wages and risk migrates from systems to individuals, the result is, unease and a sense that life is getting harder and you don't really know why. The fifth point is that planning has become much harder because costs move faster than income. So the final piece is time, meaning how money behaves across time. So prices now update quickly and income does not. Rents adjust annually. In fact, many rental contracts have an automatically increase written into them. Energy costs fluctuate seasonally and geopolitically, as do food prices. Income, by contrast, is slow and sticky. So this mismatch quietly breaks something fundamental, which is the ability to plan with confidence, which is one reason that people have given for the population decline in Europe. So life feels harder to afford because the ground rules have shifted. Costs rose in the places where you can't really opt out of. Gains migrated towards assets rather than work. Risk has moved away from systems and onto individuals. Planning became really fragile because prices move much faster than income. And constant comparison just sharpened these feelings of falling behind. So none of this is a moral failure. None of this is about laziness or entitlement or poor decisions. It is just the lived consequence of an economy that now rewards position more than effort. So the point of this video was not to make you feel hopeless. I really hope I haven't done that. The point of this video was really to encourage you to think about things differently, because I think there is a tendency, especially with educated professionals, that when things are not working, you tend to internalize it and see it as your fault and moralize the issue. And so you just start trying to work harder, you work longer hours, you go for that promotion, you try to get the salary increase. And my challenge to you is that really the right course of action? Is that efficient? Does that make sense in today's economy? And I just really want to draw your attention to the distinction between wages and assets. And I just encourage you to look further into this and to just take out the moral question and just start thinking about it logically and start thinking about what the current economy rewards and maybe potentially shift your attention and energy in that direction. That's it for now. Take care. Thanks for watching. Bye.